Welcome to the 2020 Korea Global Forum for Peace. We will start our session on Institutionalization of Peace on the Korean Peninsula, Obstacles and Overcoming Measures. In order to enroot the peace on the Korean Peninsula, what kind of institutional requirements there are will be the key point of the discussions in this session. And in the latter part of the session, we will also have a short outlook on the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. We have two presenters for this session. From the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, we have Professor Mason Ritchie. And the second presenter is joining us from Ireland, Trinity College Dublin, Professor Dongjin Kim. And we also have three discussants from Free University Berlin, Germany. We have Professor Eunjung Lee, and from George Washington University, Dr. Yeonho Kim. And finally, from University of Seoul, we have Professor Hwang Ji-hwan. In the interest of time, I'd like to ask the presenters to finish your presentations in 15 minutes, and discussants, you have 7 minutes each. And if time allows, we will also like to take questions online. And without further ado, Professor Ritchie.
Great, thank you very much. Again, I just want to thank all of the organizers for this wonderful event, and to all of the other panelists who will be joining me today, who are so incredibly distinguished. I am relatively pessimistic about the pathways towards peace on the peninsula, but I will also try to cover not only the obstacles but some of the opportunities. The other thing I'll say, just as a sort of preface, is that I am coming at this question of peace on the peninsula from the perspective of international relations and international security. And I point that out primarily because the main key that I'm going to talk about for peace in the first third of my presentation involves the concept of signaling to counterparties how a state can tie its hands for the future so that it can make credible commitments not only at a moment in time but also moving forward. And this comes out of the literature in international relations and international security. So James Fearon's work, Alexander Wendt about perceptions and trust and threat perception, Powell's work, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita looking at this from a game theory perspective, and then most recently, a sort of case study of this from Christopher Lawrence in international security. So that would be the first thing that I go through, a general key to peace about signaling costly trust and how we do that. Then I'll go through three challenges to the institutionalization and instituting of peace on the Korean Peninsula. Those are domestic politics in South Korea and the US, the larger international context in East Asia and Northeast Asia in particular, and then North Korea's leadership, interest, and behavior. And then finally, I'll close with a slide on some of the opportunities, perhaps, for reaching peace on the peninsula. Within the conflictual context on the Korean Peninsula, the four relevant states that I want to look at today, and they're not the only ones, we could include Japan and Russia, but I'm going to leave those out for the moment, have both divergent state interests, which is to say that the national interests of those states aren't aligned. They perhaps go in very different directions in terms of what they want the structure of the region to look like or what they want the Korean Peninsula itself to look like politically. The various states have leadership whose interests also diverge in many cases, and those states also have trust problems, and the leaderships between them have trust problems. I will also note that a secondary factor, one that perhaps I won't have much time to address today, but is worth thinking about, is that there's also divergence between the leadership of states in some cases and the national interest of those same states. Just to give you an example, Donald Trump, US president, seems, in my estimation and in the estimation of many people, to act in a way that doesn't actually improve the national security of the US, but instead improves his personal political and financial fortunes. We can make a very similar argument about Kim Jong-un and his party and his regime, where the national interest of North Korea isn't well served by the governance economically and politically in that country. The underlying issues within the contextual context of conflict on the peninsula are, of course, North Korea's nuclear program, the mutually perceived threats and hostility that we see demonstrated by North Korean rhetoric, US-led sanctions, and other forms of discord. And then, of course, lastly, North Korea is not a status quo state. It wants to change, in particular, the Korean Peninsula, but also power and structural relations within Northeast Asia more largely. And its way of doing so frequently involves violation of both international law and international norms. So taking all of this together, this state of affairs makes reaching peace from the status quo up until now unrealized, which is to say we haven't achieved it, and arguably without some really gigantic changes, also unrealizable almost in principle. Because peace is a reliable change of structural relations away from hostility and belligerence by the concerned states. As I would like to point out, I'm working with a definition of peace here that is perhaps different from what you see in discussions about peace declarations or end-of-war declarations, and particularly when summits and working level negotiations are in process, and we begin to think about what are the pieces of the mosaic that the U.S. and North Korea and South Korea and perhaps China can put into place so that we can have something that looks like peace on the peninsula. Frequently we end up talking about, what would it mean to have an end-of-war declaration or a peace declaration or these types of things. And my argument really is that these rhetorical tools don't really end up meaning very much, which is part of the reason why they haven't taken place yet, as we'll come to in a little bit. So instead, I'm really looking at peace as a reliable change of the structural relations among the concerned states. And when I mean reliable, I mean a series of changes in state behavior and in state perception of other states that involves making credible commitments that tie hands for states and their leaderships, not only in the present, but also in the future, and therefore send costly signals of behavior that is a change and is also very difficult to reverse. And we'll come back to why that's important. As I say, the reason why this is very difficult to realize now is because, in the first place, the states have very divergent interests and their leaderships have divergent interests, which means there's not a natural gravitation towards cooperation. Secondly, the trust problems between the states and their leaderships mean that they have a real difficult time convincing their counterparties that diplomatic and political promises are credible commitments going forward. And so here I show two images I think that sort of illustrate this. Both, I would argue, have been claimed by many people to be significant successes. One is, of course, the construction and the operation for a while of the Inter-Korean Liaison Office. The other, of course, is the downscaling and in some cases, postponement or even cancellation of certain joint exercises between the U.S. and South Korea, which North Korea frequently cites as evidence of U.S. alliance hostility to North Korea. Of course, as we know, the Inter-Korean Liaison Office was partially destroyed earlier this year by a very amateurish demolition job. And I think what I think we need to understand about that is that it wasn't just a fit of pique by North Korea, that it wasn't irrational or that it wasn't inexplicable. I think one way that we can think about it is we can say that what that liaison office functioned as was as a tool for politics and policy changing the relationship between the two Koreas. But it wasn't a relationship change itself, right? It was a tool to that end. And so North Korea didn't lose very much by blowing it up. It was blowing up a tool, not a relationship. And so I think we perhaps over-celebrated the liaison office because we tended to think that the construction of that itself indicated a change of relationship, which isn't really true. When we look at the exercises, again, these are something that can easily be snapped back. So in essence, there's no real set of future consequences that the US and South Korea have by downscaling or postponing exercises, at least over a significant period of time. Over a longer period of time, interoperability may be degraded, but at least over a short period of time, the consequences of downscaling these exercises aren't very significant, and so North Korea, I would say quite rationally, doesn't assume that this is a very significant gesture. So if you put all that together, proposed declarations that end the Korean War, intentional statements of peace, so let's sign a peace statement or something like that, failed to convince the leaderships in Seoul, Pyongyang, and Washington. And the reason for that is that they're reversible, especially when there's a change in government in Washington or Seoul. So, for instance, Lee Myung-bak can come in and more or less roll back sunshine policy. We've seen what happens when government changes happen in the US and one presidential administration comes in and changes the previous sets of policies. Also violations of the spirit of the agreement, for these types of end-of-war declarations and peace treaties and statements like that are simply too easy. And so I would just ask, for instance, a sort of rhetorical question that's worth thinking about, which is, if the types of changes, in terms of cooperation between the North and South that I think many of us believe that the current Moon administration would be interested in terms of perhaps tours at Mount Kumgang or relieving the May 24 sanctions. If those could be done in a way that doesn't violate international sanctions, which could be done because there's a way to do them without involving bulk cash transfers, why hasn't the Moon administration done that? And I would argue it's because even the Moon government here knows that the alliance and the political cost of doing so, because doing so would make Washington, at least currently, very unhappy, outweighs the benefits in terms of altering Korean Peninsula hostility. Essentially, North Korea knows that these types of steps, Kumgang, or relieving May 24 sanctions, are too easily reversible. Why? Because North Korea has also done that, right? Let's think about what North Korea did to Kumgang itself, right? They essentially also reversed, that cooperation through, condemning the buildings there and essentially saying that, this project is off the table. So the bottom line is that, things like declarations of the end of war, intentional statements of peace, they don't fundamentally alter a structural relationship of hostility and threats, because they really haven't contained significantly costly signals that the parties involved are willing to take steps that tie their hands in the future through significant sunk costs in initial agreements and the pathways locking in obligations to future cooperation. We're still, I would argue, when we start talking about the end of war declaration and these types of things, not only do they not imply costly signals for future behavior, but they actually bring up some fairly complex international legal problems. For instance, whether or not South Korea has standing to sign any type of end-of-war declaration, insofar as it wasn't a signatory itself, right? This distracts, I think, from the issue of changing structural relationships and in our understanding of the threat perception and hostilities on the peninsula. And also, these approaches tend to frame peace declarations and the process behind it in a carrot-stick modality. And this, in turn, supports the logic of measures with reversible cost, because the whole point of a carrot-stick mentality is that it's an inducement for a certain set of behavior. It's effectively speaking a bribe. And those bribes are almost entirely, or those inducements or incentives, if you want to use a different term, a more technical term, are usually reversible. So a key component, therefore, of political and diplomatic cooperative movement towards peace is costly signals that tie hands in the future and therefore commit parties to behavioral pathways that change the structural relational threats and the hostility. So in practice, this means that parties need to front-load irreversible costs and make sacrifices while accepting reversible benefits, or if it's not a reversible benefit, a set of benefit streams that are backloaded. And so Christopher Lawrence, in a recent article in International Security, uses the agreed framework as an example of this in what he calls techno-diplomatic cooperation. And his basic argument is that the light water reactor construction project that was a part of the agreed framework satisfied those conditions of front-loading heavy costs and making sacrifices on both sides, the North Korean side and the US side, while accepting a reversible set of benefits. And you might be saying, aha, this is too smart by half because the agreed framework failed, and indeed it did. But his argument is it failed largely because what happened is that Washington, in particular Congress, began to misinterpret the techno-diplomatic cooperation in the agreed framework as a form of inducement. They began to think of it not as a change of relationships from hostile to more cooperative or more peaceful, but rather as a carrot and stick approach, or as a part of a carrot and stick approach. At which point they cut funding for it, they internationalized the funding to Quito, as we all know, and North Korea at that point said, well, the US doesn't have any more skin in the game for this, and so we're not interested in this anymore either. And of course, the whole process began to degrade, and then of course, John Bolton and Bush came in, and in 2002, Bolton ended up, as he said, smashing the agreed framework with a hammer. So I admit, right, the front loading of irreversible costs and sacrifices while accepting reversible benefits is a very heavy lift, right? The sequence of steps to doing this is very critical, very tricky, and distrust among the parties makes even getting to this stage very difficult in the first place. One of the main problems is that, a peace process with an asymmetrical time dimension, so front-loaded costs, back-loaded benefits, is very difficult on the Korean Peninsula because of the distrust between the actors here. And so this is why we take the path of least resistance, which to look at it primarily through a carrot and stick approach, which has symmetrically reversible costs and benefits. And the idea here, and this fits well within a certain cooperation literature, is that small, low-cost cooperation builds trust towards higher-order, riskier cooperation. But if we simply look at the history of this inducement and coercion approach has simply failed, both on the peace count and on the denuclearization account. So therefore, negotiations toward peace, which include denuclearization, need these credible commitments by counterparties. I think pessimism is warranted. This is going to be very hard, and it's going to be very unlikely. And with that, I'll go to the challenges. First of all, you're going to have, in order to make this heavy lift happen, you're going to have broad bipartisan domestic buy-in in the US and South Korea in order to routinize and institutionalize a peace plan or process or agreement. Otherwise, North Korea and China, for instance, aren't going to believe that a peace process or plan or agreement is going to be sustainable or survivable after a change of government. This is really hard right now. The US is highly polarized, South Korea is highly polarized, and having bipartisan domestic buy-in for a risky proposition on peace on the Korean Peninsula is a very difficult thing to ask politically right now. Therefore, in order to achieve that, you're going to have the US and South Korea with top leadership that's able to unite in a bipartisan way on a major foreign policy issue, so that when government change takes place, there will be policy continuity. North Korea is going to demand this as a part of its expectation of costly signals and sacrifices. Unfortunately, the bipartisan basis for this in the US, I think, has evaporated slowly over the period after the Cold War and has accelerated under Obama and currently under Trump, of course. In the South Korean case, we've never seen a progressive to conservative or conservative to progressive governmental change in which North Korea-related policy demonstrated continuity. So the first question is, where is this bipartisanship going to come from? Where is this leadership going to come from? Secondly, looking at the international context, you're going to have the leaderships of South Korea, North Korea, the U.S., all simultaneously interested in peace and denuclearization negotiations. And I can, if you want, during the question and answer, talk about why denuclearization has to be a part of this from the U.S. perspective. You have to have the governments competently staffed with available bandwidth, willing to give their negotiators autonomy, which is one of the things that we know Kim Jong-un didn't do with his working level negotiation team with Steve Biegun this time. And of course, they have to not be overly distracted and hindered in dealing with other issues and crises, as well as political cycles, right? Right now, things are in a holding pattern because we're waiting for November. And so you have to have the political calendars align as well. Another part of the international context is you're much more likely to have success under a certain set of relationships between the U.S. and South Korean presidents. A U.S. Republican president and a South Korean conservative president are unlikely to work on peace in an effective way that North Korea is willing to buy into. A U.S. Democratic president and a South Korean conservative president could happen. A U.S. Republican president and a South Korean progressive president could also happen. In fact, we've seen that in theory with Trump and in Moon, although not very effectively, largely because of, in my estimation, Trump, but that's a different story. And then, of course, a U.S. Democratic president and a South Korean progressive president, I think you're again likely to find some opportunities for the two presidents to work together. Lastly, on this international context, before I briefly turn to North Korea and then conclude, on a strategic level, the U.S. and China also need to be sufficiently and meaningfully related that they can coordinate and cooperate on a sub-issue of their larger rivalry. What the U.S. wants is sufficient sanctions enforcement from China that at least leads North Korea to the table in the first place. If North Korea wants to torpedo that sanctions enforcement, then North Korea doesn't have any incentive to come to, or not enough incentive to come to the negotiating table in the first place. Third challenge, North Korea. North Korea is the biggest impediment to Korean Peninsula peace and reconciliation. It's a belligerent revisionist state. It has an illegal nuclear weapons program. It's a serial violator of human rights. Its leadership behavior is at odds with its national interest, and is disastrously governed economically and politically. Therefore, you're going to have a significant change in the political leadership. It's going to have to accept more risk. It's going to have to respect the logic of costly signaling. And it's going to have to feel just enough economic pressure that it feels like it needs to come to the table, but not so much that it feels like it's constantly, on the brink of collapse and under the thumb of international sanctions so much that the hostility is so large that it won't even bother coming to the table. This is hard to get. So there's going to need to be internal reform. I don't mean regime change, but at least it needs to understand that there's a long-term incentivization and behavioral alignment of its leadership interests with its national interests. Lastly, opportunities is my last slide. Thank you for letting me go a minute over. I think Trump-Kim summits have opened up the acceptability of negotiated solutions. In some ways, Trump meeting with Kim is a little bit like Nixon going to China. This has path dependence for future, even Democratic presidents. At least Trump opened up a door that now other Democratic presidents can take perhaps in the future. Secondly, South Korean progressives will possibly, maybe even likely, win another presidential mandate, which might make it more possible to have a long-term policy continuity with respect to North Korea. Moon has not so far, in my estimation, built up bipartisan support for his North Korea initiatives. On the other hand, the fact that his progressive party might have another 5-year term might be able to blunt that. Plus, he has a supermajority in the National Assembly, which means that if he can push through some type of peace deal that could be institutionalized in South Korean law, that would anchor in place something that might have some long-term effect. And then thirdly, you're going to have luck. You're going to have the domestic factors, the international factors, and North Korea have some internal change, more or less all simultaneously. I'm not saying those things won't happen. I'm saying it's very difficult, and in the current environment, it's improbable. I hope that I'm wrong, and with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
예, 고맙습니다. 리치 교수님.
Thank you, Professor Ritchie. I understand you have quite a critical point of view about the peace on the Korean Peninsula.
의미한다.
And you also talked about the definition of peace, which regards to a structural change. That was quite impressive. Let us now go on to our next speaker.
From the Trinity College Dublin. We have Dr. Kim. Please finish up your remarks in 15 minutes. Good morning. Can you hear me well? Good morning. I am from Trinity College Dublin. My name is Kim Dong-jin. The topic of my presentation is the sustainability of the peace process on the Korean Peninsula and the reciprocal empowerment with international regime. As you well know, the term peace process means a tentative rapprochement between parties in a protracted conflict that is conducted in an experimental way. The peace process, as you can see from the very term, peace process is not a fixed form. It goes through a number of different stages. First, there is the pre-negotiation, followed by the implementation and management of the process, and then reaching a peace accord, and finally post-accord reconstruction in a post-conflict world. And in this peace-building process, the term that refers to all the actions taken will be peace-building, really. And the word peace-building has been used since the 1990s. Ever since the 1960s, by scholars such as Galtung, peace building has been used. And this refers to how to overcome war and fighting and to enroot a permanent peace in an active manner. So to answer those questions, the term peace building was coined, and in 1992, the UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali used the term peace building in his An Agenda for Peace report. And as Boutros Ghali has mentioned, peacemaking and peacekeeping are required to halt conflicts, but it will be difficult to prevent the recurrence of violence if the peacemaking and peacekeeping processes are not fully instituted. And Lederach also mentioned that signed papers do not make a difference and the agreements collapse unless the processes of genuine engagement are created to engage the relevant people. But the international peace-building activities and the architecture has been subject to a series of criticisms since the 90s. Despite the peace-building architecture and actions, most of the peace-building process has collapsed or are quite unstable. Some of the criticisms include the fact that these architectures are conducted by the West and are external interventions, and they are universalist and top-down. And there is too much focus on liberal state building led by the West. And the peace scholars who criticize the international peace-building architecture claim that the model example would be a local turn and to undergo emancipatory peace apart from the suppression experienced previously, and also a peace focused on the everyday life of the people. And they have, from these perspectives, followed some institutional measures to make this happen. And in this sense, I think that there is a large amount of comparative study being done to share the parallels and differences in the challenges and opportunities of each different peace process, and to share the contemporary peace process and the experience sprung from the West's experience of overcoming the First and Second World Wars, and to implant that elsewhere, and also to help those who experience conflict around the world to share their experiences altogether and to serve as useful lessons for each situation. And in this sense, comparing the peace process and sharing experience in an is a bit different from the empowerment process done by international aid. It is a more, rather than being a linear process, this is a more reciprocal empowerment process that draws a circle. So in this circular process, reciprocal empowerment is similar in that knowledge is shared, but going beyond the local community taking the initiative of this process, in reciprocal empowerment, in the very process itself, the people that are actually directly involved will take initiative and participation, and they would build empathy and work towards one another and for one another and themselves. So from the reciprocal empowerment perspective, I have studied the process that has been in place in Ireland. As someone who studies both the Korean Peninsula experience and the Ireland experience, I see that these two regions are quite comparable in terms of peace agreement and the ongoing process and peace building research and practice. Some even say that Korea is the East's Irish. There was the Belfast Agreement in 1998 signed in Ireland, and in the process and the content of the agreement has raised much attention around the world. It has been considered to be quite successful compared to other international agreements, and this served as a very good source of research and studies. But despite the signing of the peace agreement, the peace process is still ongoing and provides us with a rich source of imagination. And nevertheless, Ireland and the peace process on the Korean Peninsula have their distinct differences, because the Korean Peninsula is about a region where people share ethnic identity, and they have two different incompatible goals to build a state. But in Ireland and the UK, they shared a similar economic system, and also, but they had a very different religious and almost incompatible religious differences. And in terms of structure of the division, Korea is divided into North and South, and Ireland had a North-South division and also the UK-Ireland division. And lastly, geopolitically, the Korean Peninsula was impacted by the Cold War structure and under the influence of regional powers, but Ireland was under a very favorable geopolitical influence. But both Korea and Ireland have had incompatible goals, and they went through the pains of war. And to overcome that process, peace process was needed in both regions. But simply put, depending on what national flag you want and what national flag you cannot give up, that was really the key source of conflicts. And against that backdrop, the peace process took place. And in the process of this peace process, a meaningful agreement was reached in a quite similar time frame. In the two regions, there was the 1972 joint communique of July 4th in Korea and the 1973 Sunningdale communique. And ensuingly, there were a series of different agreements at similar timing, including the 1994 ceasefire agreement in Ireland. There were a series of different agreements that took place that faced oppositions and overcoming and reconciliation, and the process is ongoing. John Hume, the late John Hume, who recently passed away, really won the Nobel Peace Prize, and also he led all the efforts that led up to the 94 agreement. And he mentioned that the 94 agreement was a re-education process for those who lacked the understanding for Sunningdale Communique in 1973. So the two different groups with incompatible goals still need to build peace. And in that process, rather than focusing on just insisting on their own incompatible goal, respecting one another was really important, and that has to be institutionalized. And that was the basic awareness in the 1970s. But nevertheless, despite due to huge opposition, reaching an agreement was very, very difficult. That was actually what I directly heard from Mr. Hume. And as you can see, for the Korean Peninsula, there was a number of different agreements as well. And first, there was the agreement to first build peace and trust. In Ireland, if you look at the Good Friday Agreement, there was understanding of the aspiration for unification, but that has to be determined without external impediment and through the exercise of the right of self-determination. That was the basic principle for peace. And in the June 15th Joint Declaration, there was similar context, saying that as masters of the country, the Korean people shall determine the unification, stressing self-determination, and peace and coexistence has to happen first. But the biggest difference between Ireland and Korea is that after signing the peace agreement, the South and North Ireland, the Northern Ireland and Ireland, no longer have a legal border. And if we look at the Irish case, it has quite similarities with the Korean Peninsula, but after the peace agreement was signed, the Ireland revised their constitution and said that the United Island shall be brought about only by peaceful means with the consent of the majority of the people. And what kind of lessons we can learn from both regions? I think we can come to 5 points. First, mutual respect and sovereignty issues. In the peace process, the political leadership and institutions, the issue of geopolitical conditions, and in particular in Ireland, as you can see, ever since the peace process began, this is the worst geopolitical condition that Ireland has been put in. And we can also consider the socio-cultural and economic aspects who can benefit from the peace process, and also the peace-building role of the civil society. Just as in Korea, in Ireland, the civil society played a huge role in institutionalizing peace and also gaining the consent and consensus from the people. After the Irish peace process, there was a peace wall, a barrier that divides the Northern Ireland with Ireland. But in a sense, that barrier became higher. It's been about 6 years since I moved to Ireland, and in the meantime, more than 200 Korean delegations visited over 15 occasions to learn from Ireland. And there were a number of Koreans, more than 50, who visited through me or in some kind of affiliation with myself. And they often raise the question that follows. Would opening the border between North and South Korea be possible while maintaining the division, and how? And would North and South Korea need to recognize each other's sovereignty? And how can the people and the states sustain peace-building projects on the Korean Peninsula? So these are the questions that are still unanswered in Ireland, and there is no right answer to these questions because no matter how far along you are in institutionalization, building a peaceful and just society for the people necessarily inevitably needs to engage the very people who are involved. For instance, in Northern Ireland and Ireland, peace brought great economic benefits, but in Northern Ireland still, there are annual events of burning the Irish flag. And there are some people who say in interviews that they would rather live in the poor Ireland than rich Northern Ireland. And in the process of holding a referendum, discussing and participating, engaging people to discuss how to build peace truly in the region was not actually done very well. Only the institutionalization itself was stressed. And last year, I was going through a number of different peace theories to write a paper, and I learned that we need to overcome institutionalization and also deeply consider how to engage the residents, the people in this peace-building process. How to do that really is the make or break factor in a peace-building strategy and a process. So that is the key topic I am currently studying. The South-South conflict in Korea has bipolarized the country between people who are for or against the North Korea policies of the government. And this is the same in Ireland. Anyone who voices dissent in their groups are considered to be their spies or be traitors. So in Korea also we need to think of how to come to a converged agreement on how to build a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula rather than always being in conflict with which is the right way. So signing the peace agreement through international cooperation, I think, are very, very significant and important goals. But learning from Ireland, we do need to engage the people themselves. Without true engagement of the people, we cannot guarantee the permanence of an institutionalized peace process. We also need to revise the National Security Act or International Exchange Cooperation Act. And we also need to build national consensus before all this happens. And to do that, we need to understand that all our goals are not necessarily mutually incompatible. They can be strategically overlapped. And in Ireland, there was strategic discussion in the early 1990s of how what the people's aspirations are and what kind of strategic overlaps there can be. But in the process that ensued, the civil process collapsed, and they are still trying to build peace in Ireland. And there were also criticisms that the peace-building process only was rendered as a simple institutional process and formality. So those who study the Irish experience are also thinking how to engage people in Korea to build the peace on the Korean Peninsula. And since 2018, the peace atmosphere built on the Korean Peninsula raised great expectations. However, unfortunately, the peace process seems to have halted once again in Korea. And this is time when we need to build consensus within the government, but also with the people. If Irish example is any lesson, cooperating with North Korea and the international community to work towards signing a true and working agreement is the process to take. And from the peace-building process, even the general citizens, the general people of Korea need to study and look into and share experience with countries like Ireland. And as the Irish example shows, sharing experience and building capacity for the peace process engages a number of different processes, and we need to learn and we need to also imagine. But in the peace process, empowerment and sharing experience also needs to be done hand in hand with North Korea. And perhaps that can enable the track 1.5 and 2.0s. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kim. So I would like to raise 3 questions for the discussion. While you compare the Irish and Korean case, you mentioned the conflict over different goals. So in Korea, that could be conflict over unification. And in resolving that conflict, peace, coexistence and peace should come first, as was the case in Ireland. And secondly, I think this is quite different from what Professor Ritchie said. In order to overcome the conflict, you said that you needed a step-by-step process. And number 3, as Professor Ritchie has mentioned as well, for a permanent peace process, a domestic consensus, national consensus building. How we can institutionalize national consensus building would be the key question to answer. So we are quite behind schedule, and I can only give 5 minutes to each discuss it. Professor Lee, could you go first?
Yes, Dr. Kim and Professor Ritchie, thank you very much for your impressive presentations, and especially the Ireland case by Dr. Kim. Actually, I'm very glad that the discourse about Ireland is being mentioned here in Korea. Whenever we talk about the Korean Peninsula, up till now we only talked about the German case, but I think that now we have more cases that we look for reference, so I think diversity is good. What you mentioned, however, I think that we have to take it to one more level, a little bit more complex, because Dr. Kim, you mentioned
you mentioned that the citizens have to be a part of the actors, so we need to diversify the group of actors. But as I study the German case, that is exactly what I am proposing. However, what's important is that within Korea, not only diversifying actors within Korea, we need to diversify actors internationally. And Professor Ritchie said,
he talked about South Korea, North Korea, China, the US, and then of course there's Russia and Japan. But in order to establish a peace regime, then what would be the role of Europe? That is a question that I would like to raise. You asked about the role of the civil society, but likewise, I would like to ask about the role of Europe. When we talk about the German unification case, we talk about Helsinki process. The Helsinki process, however, is not a process that involved bilateral cooperation, but actually it involved multilateral cooperation. And so there were many different communities that got together and cooperated. And so quite a number of countries were involved. So it was not just two sides or two parties engaged in the negotiations. So on the Korean Peninsula, well, let's say that there are 6 actors or 6 countries. There's the 2 Koreas, China, the US, Japan, and Russia. But I think that just fixing the number of the actors in the Korean Peninsula to these 6 actually might be an impediment to the peace process in the Korean Peninsula. So perhaps we might think about the European community that can play a different role, that can provide us with a new card, a different card for us in the talks towards this process. Now, if you look at EU today and also Germany and France, these countries, they are very interested in the Korean Peninsula peace process. However, within the EU also, I think that there are different views or positions about the process. For example, Sweden, for example, wants to support dialogue and obtaining peace through dialogue, whereas France or Germany, if you look at their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, like the Department of State, emphasizes sanctions. So even within the EU, there are very different positions. So this US, China, North Korea, South Korea, if we lock ourselves into this framework of only the 4 parties, then we might continue this stalemate. So I think that perhaps we should expand our perspectives to enable more entities or actors to participate in this dialogue about the peace process of the Korean Peninsula. And the most difficult part about the peace process on the Korean Peninsula is sanctions. So not many people ask about what are sanctions. If you look at Sweden, for example, sanctions is not for sanctions, but sanctions is for peace. That is what Sweden is clearly saying. But if you look at countries such as Germany or France or US, this type of discourse is not coming out. So I think that we need more actors to come to the negotiation table to broaden our perspectives. So I would like to ask the 2 speakers' perspective on what I just said, and also to establish a peace regime. I think that the prerequisite for the approach for a peace process, I think, is diversification of actors. So I think that on the Korean Peninsula, we need diversification of actors, and also we have to think about diversification of actors on the international community as well. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. And now let us go on to Dr. Kim.
하겠습니다.
예, 안녕하세요.
Good morning. I thought
워싱턴에
So I would like to talk about the atmosphere here in the United States, Washington, linking my talk to Dr. Ruchi's presentation. Now, the USFK and the future of the US-ROK alliance is being talked about, and actually it's like opening up the box of Pandora. So the Korean Peninsula peace regime, whenever we talk about this, I think that the heartbeat of people say that the heartbeat of the US political circle actually accelerates. As you know, the Korean Peninsula issue is mainly focused on denuclearization within the United States. Denuclearization, in order for this to be linked with or aligned with the Korean Peninsula peace process, I think that there has to be a consensus reached. But for that, there are too many obstacles that we have to overcome. For example, there was a historic North Korea and the U.S. summit, and also there were talk about the denuclearization and also the peace regime. However, there were criticism that they were not able to overcome the past achievements. And also, there was some skepticism surrounding this issue. And also, if you look at the domestic political issues that constrain the dialogue or the discourse about the Korean Peninsula peace process, well, President Trump held talks with Kim Jong-un twice. What was mostly criticized within the U.S. was that the U.S. president indirectly acknowledged the legitimacy of the dictator of North Korea. And Joe Biden, the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party, I think, implied about this during his public speech. So I think that domestically there is the pessimistic view about the past approach of the U.S. when it comes to talks with North Korea and going towards the peace process or peace agreement. And also there used to be a view that humanitarian issues should be excluded from the North Korean nuclear negotiations. But after the report of the UN, actually there has been a change of atmosphere. The humanitarian issues is not a sub-issue of North Korean issues, and it is not an obstacle for denuclearization of North Korea, but rather it can be an index for identifying the willingness of North Korea to resolve issues. And also it should be included in the dialogue between North Korea and the U.S. And I think that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party thinks alike on this topic. And also the most renowned negotiators who have negotiated with North Korea also agrees with this. And also the hacking of Sony Pictures and also Otto Warmbier incident. Well, because of these incidents, I think that there is a growing view that North Korea is an evil state. So I think that there is growing interest in focusing on both denuclearization and human rights issues as we go towards the peace agreement or the establishment of peace in the Korean Peninsula. And that's kind of the atmosphere that we can find in Washington.
Thank you for sharing with us the views from Washington. So, Ms. Lee, you mentioned the diversification of actors, and I think that whenever the issue of Korean Peninsula and peace comes up in the U.S., it is often interpreted quite with a negative perspective. And also, Mr. Kim mentioned that the diversification of actors are interlinked with the issue of human rights issues in North Korea. So how we can include the agenda of the human rights issues in North Korea in this process will be a key point of discussion as well. And Professor Hwang, please. Yes, thank you to the two presenters. It was very, very interesting in presentation. And what was most impressive was that both of you mentioned reciprocity, mutuality. Dr. Kim called it a reciprocal empowerment, how to reinforce the reciprocity in institutionalizing peace on the Korean Peninsula. And in that sense, you also compare the case with the experience of Ireland. And relatively, the peace process in Ireland and their institutionalization, although not fully, you really shared quite a positive prospect, while as Professor Ritchie mentioned a negative perspective. In the international studies area, there are a number of different methods and theories discussed in terms of mutuality or reciprocity. And cost signaling was the key, most important point in your presentation. Towards peace, sometimes we can there are gains, but there are some things to give, to compromise. What's difficult is compromising first and then gaining later. That kind of whole presumption can be a big obstacle in reaching ultimate peace. And in that sense, Dr. Kim, I think, shared a more rosy outlook, but Professor Mason Ritchie shared with us a somewhat negative outlook. So how to institutionalize peace and to make permanent and sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula? In answering this question, we need to think about reciprocity more. In this session, just focusing on the two presentations, and in particular with how Ireland reached a reciprocal peace. I think there is much to learn from Irish experience, and theoretically speaking, as Professor Ritchie mentioned, this is very, very difficult as history tells. But we can still learn from this past experience of the Korean Peninsula, and we need to keep these lessons in mind as we devise future policies. And just one more thing, as Professor Lee mentioned, the issue of actors. And Dr. Kim, I think one of the most important messages from your presentation was to discuss at a multiple level from multiple aspects. But Professor Mason Ritchie, you really focused on the governmental relations and the obstacles. Intergovernmental relations, of course, are very, very important, but we also need to discuss multiple different levels. So not only the North Korean regime, but the people of North Korea. What can we do policy-wise for the people? And in building the peace process, how can the people of North and South Korea can communicate with one another is a key point that warrants attention, but has not really gained much attention so far. So in this sense, I think we can find a breakthrough for the reciprocity issue. Thank you to the two discussants. I wanted to raise a few questions, but
프로세스에서 사실은
And in the Korean Peninsula peace process, I think that there are obstacles and difficulties and challenges, and action to action, rhetoric to rhetoric has been emphasized in the past. And that is because in the past we have experienced how giving concessions in the front loading did not actually lead to benefits later on. But anyhow, having said that, can we hear some answers from the speakers? First, Dr. Ritchie, on the points made by the discussants, can you make your remarks?
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the really high quality comments from both the moderator and the discussants. I really appreciate it. I'll start with one thing that sort of speaks to Professor Kim's presentation, and also something that Professor Wang pointed out. Indeed, I'm in my presentation focusing much more on high level, even very high top level relationships, rather than the relationships between the people and civil society, which is not to say that I don't think that the second is important. I absolutely think that it is. And one of the ways that at least the subtext of that is true is that I do point out the need for, at least in South Korea, consensus building for the institutionalization of peace as a process. And in that sense, I actually think, although Professor Wang is again correct that I'm relatively pessimistic, and Professor Kim has perhaps a somewhat more potentially optimistic outlook, I do think that in some ways we have a little bit of complementarity, in that my top-down approach can be complemented by his approach at looking at some of the popular facets of how peace can happen. And we also share, I think, the basic position, as you pointed out right at the beginning of your presentation, that words on a signed agreement don't mean very much without engagement. I think the question then is, what kind of engagement? And how do we ensure that engagement is locked in as a process going forward? And then turning to Professor Lee, so we had just spoken very briefly, before we got started, about the fact that I have a dual appointment in both European studies and also in international studies, and so I'm actually is one of my two appointments in the European Studies department, and one of the things that I'm really interested in is how the European Union's common foreign and security policy and common security and defense policy can have an application to Northeast Asia, and in particular to the Korean Peninsula. This is something I'm tremendously interested in. I just had a paper come out in the Korean Journal of Defense Analysis about exactly this issue. So I hope that the absence of that doesn't reflect badly on that. I apologize for that. That being said, I think really, to some degree, Professor Lee's points that she makes in a way answer themselves, in that France and Germany simply look at the Korean process, the Korean Peninsula, as primarily a non-proliferation issue. And of course they're interested in human rights, and of course they're interested in peace and all of those things. They're interested in cybersecurity and a lot of different things that are going on here. But at the end of the day, the top line issue is non-proliferation. And they've got one big tool that they think works, or at least would like to think works, and that's sanctions. And as we say in good English, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's the nail that they keep hammering on. And so, there are other states that have different perspectives, but for the European Union to be an effective engager here, you're going to have, I think, at least some reconciliation between those two perspectives within the EU. I would also note that to some degree the lack of hard power credibility in the region doesn't help either, although that's changing, at least I think to some degree, with France's engagement, for instance, with Japan, and in the larger Indo-Pacific region. We're also seeing Germany, which just put out through its foreign office a new Leitlinien on the Indo-Pacific, and that they do discuss in that the Korean Peninsula, although it's primarily cyber, and the peace process and denuclearization actually aren't really a part of the new Leitlinien, which I think is not a great sign. So to answer your question, role for Europe, my answer is yes. I'm a full-throated supporter of more Europe on the Korean Peninsula, but I think you have to do so in two different challenges. The first of which is you have to get over the divisions within the EU and some capability and capacity problems, which are fairly significant. And the second one is, remember, North Korea has to take Europe seriously for Europe to play a role. They have to recognize and acknowledge them as an actor with some value added to bring. And at the end of the day, North Korea doesn't see Europe as a threat. It sees the US as a threat, and arguably South Korea. And so in that sense, North Korea is going to have to see what Europe can bring to the table in a way that makes it take Europe seriously, insofar as its primary concern is with the hostility and belligerence that it perceives from the U.S. And then the very last point I would make, as Professor Kim mentioned in Washington, I would say that in my estimation, it's humbly, it's not only the fact that some people thought that Trump legitimized Kim as a dictator. I think at first that discussion was fairly significant, but I think at some point we might have kind of overcome that a little bit or at least like he's created facts on the ground where maybe like that in theory isn't such a huge issue anymore, and we've already done it. The door's open, so it could happen again, I think, even under a Democratic president. I think the bigger problem in some sense is, first of all, if we're looking at Biden, if he comes into office, every expectation is that we're going to see some version of strategic patience 2.0. So at least in the short term, I think that's an issue. And then the second thing with Trump, in terms of his meeting in Singapore and perhaps to a lesser degree in Hanoi, is that the big criticism was he didn't take it seriously as a process of negotiation. He took it as a photo opportunity and as a part of a larger effort to brand himself as a certain type of deal maker president. I mean, we knew that already, but Bolton's book obviously just reinforces that. So I do at least think I'm at least a little bit optimistic that Trump, for all of his flaws, has at least in some small way operated as a sort of incompetent Nixon goes to China, in the sense that he's opened up the door, I think, where it's okay now, perhaps in the future, under the right circumstances, for either a more moderate Republican and more competent Republican or even a Democrat to perhaps engage North Korea in a way that they weren't capable of doing so before, particularly the Democrats, because they would always be branded as soft on North Korea. So I think that's one positive takeaway.
리치 교수님 고맙습니다.
Thank you, Professor Ritchie. And Dr. Kim, thank you for the discussions, and also to Professor Mason Ritchie, and also to the moderator, Mr. Koo. Thank you all for your comments. And I agree with everything that you have said. And as Professor Ritchie has just mentioned, my presentation and Professor Ritchie's presentation, I think, can be very mutually complementary, because from my perspective, the role of the civil society in building peace is the topic of my studies and research, but the government's role is also so important. And the efforts by the civil society to build peace necessitates also the important roles to be played by the government, and that I'm very, very much aware of the importance of the intergovernmental relationships and the role. And in terms of diversifying the actors of the peace-building process and discussions, I also believe, as Ms. Lee mentioned, Europe has a huge role to play, and Ireland, where I am staying, is a part of the European Union itself. And nations such as Germany and other nations that have been mentioned can play a huge role and raise multiple voices in the peace-building process on the Korean Peninsula. And as Professor Ritchie has mentioned, I think that there is the perception by the North Korea that EU is not that much of a threat to North Korea. And so, in the process of opening up discussions and building peace, the European Union can open up a number of different possibilities. And in that sense, diversifying the actors of building peace is very, very important. And I'd like to go a step further and mention the reciprocal empowerment process, which is really about what we can do to a region where there is a institution that is already complete and simply implanting that elsewhere. That is not what I'm talking about, but how we can really engage in reciprocal empowerment where conflict ensues. And also, as Professor Lee mentioned, I am thinking about how you've actually expanded the scope, and that's exactly what I want to do as well. So how we can engage Africa or Latin America or wider regions of the world that have ongoing conflicts to share their experiences at multiple levels. And while politicians engage in political agreements and they can come in and share their experience, and civil society as well can meet one another and share experience as well. And as I mentioned earlier, in building peace, reaching national consensus and institutionalizing this consensus is very, very tricky. Because even if a peace accord is signed, if the people do not agree with the accord or they are not a part of that accord, the accord is useless. And as I mentioned, in Ireland, the idea was that once peace agreement is institutionalized, people can meet one another face to face and shed their hostilities. But the flip side is that more interaction could lead to greater hatred against one another. And amid this situation, in order to overcome all these obstacles, people need to stop insisting on only their own interests and goals. You need to open up to other cases and experiences. And in that process of sharing, you can also look at your own situation more with a wider perspective. And in that process, we can have new imaginations and new ideas. So in the process of discussing peace, human rights issues or nuclear programs can be a hot point of dispute, and we need to discuss all those difficult issues as well, but we need to also go beyond that and look at the peace process of different regions that have experienced or are undergoing conflicts, and engage in a wider discussion in a track 1.5 or track 2.0 process to also discuss somewhat sensitive agenda and put our situation into perspective by learning from and listening to examples of other regions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kim.
시간을 조금 더 주셔서
So the organizer has given us more time, a little bit more time. So if there's anything more to add, the panelists, please go ahead. Dr. Hwang? Yes, or perhaps Dr. Kim? Director Kim, is there anything more you would like to add? Yes, if I may add a little bit more to my previous remarks. Now, in the case of Washington, especially when it comes to military security, that's actually the focal point that Washington is interested in at this moment when it comes to the Korean Peninsula. But I think that there's room for improvement. In order for peace on the Korean Peninsula, it's not only the military security that we have to talk about, but also we have to talk about economic security as well. However, in the U.S., there are not many experts on this topic. And also, there's not a lot of active discourse about the North Korean nuclear issue as well. And there has been research conducted on the changing political, economic, and social environment of the Korean Peninsula, but I don't think that the outcomes of these research have been read by or have been acknowledged by the experts on this topic in the U.S. So I think that because of their limited knowledge, the focus now when it comes to these issues actually has been focusing on rehabilitation. And I think that the U.S. and Korea has to communicate more, and there has to be more investment in human resources in an active manner so that we can have more productive discourse related to the Korean Peninsula peace process in the future. Yes, Dr. Lee? Yes. So, in relation to what Dr. Kim just said, now what he's saying is that when it comes to the Korea Peninsula peace process, in order to institutionalize the peace process, we need to diversify the topic. Not only the diversification of actors, but also we have to include human rights and economic issues and cultural issues. So, I think that we have to diversify the actors along with the topics. So we should not just focus on denuclearization, for example. If we only focus on denuclearization, we can fall perhaps into confrontation. So if we fall into a stalemate because we only focus on negotiations about the denuclearization, we can turn our eyes to include other issues and find a breakthrough. That is what was experienced by Europe. So what was just mentioned by Dr. Kim is that not only the economy, but I think he's saying that various other topics should be included in the Korean Peninsula peace process. At least that's my view. And Dr. Hwang?
Yes. Going back to what I have mentioned, the principle of reciprocity was my discussion, and Dr. Kim and Professor Ritchie's points were slightly different. So ultimately, between North and South Korea, what can we do? Well, the two Koreas, whether they send costly signals or institutionalize something or learn from the Irish experience, we need to make changes to the current positions. That's the starting point. Otherwise, we will just go through a vicious cycle over and over again. So in that sense, I think that North Korea needs to think about changing their state policies. And as Professor Ritchie mentioned, we also need to think about what the X factor is. And with that in mind, our civil society and our government also need to widen their scope of thinking of how to find a breakthrough in the areas that we haven't thought about. And Professor Ritchie, anything to add?
Not particularly. I think the comments from the discussants are all right. Is it possible for me to ask a question? Can I ask a question?
예, 괜찮습니다.
I would be interested in hearing from Director Kim in Washington, what the feeling is, what the sentiment is in Washington. Policymakers, future members of a Biden administration, if he were to win, might come in from think tanks into an administration. What is the thought in Washington now among current or former policymakers, think tankers, that set of people, about what we can expect in the short term, let's say between now and November? And then I think more importantly, what we can expect, given, outcome A where Trump stays in office versus outcome B if Biden were to come into office.
김현우 소장님,
예.
짧게.
Yes, can you briefly answer this question, including your outlook for the presidential election of the U.S.? Well, yes. I think that up till now, there seems to be some factors that make it look Trump is in a more disadvantaged position, but I think that people are very cautious to predict. So people are saying that we have to wait until the presidential election itself. But if Trump is reelected, then probably a legacy project will be launched. So in his second term, probably Trump will try to obtain a big deal so that he can leave his mark in history. A big deal with North Korea. If Biden is elected, I think the view is that Biden would probably try to erase the footprints or the tracks of President Trump's past policy towards North Korea. So probably rather than a top-down policy, perhaps there might be a turn to the more traditional approach that was pursued by the U.S., a more hardline policy, meaning more pressure towards North Korea. So I think that that's the overall view in Washington.
네, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much. And I think we have used up all our time. COVID-19 in the face of COVID-19, we are thinking about what can be the next sustainable development. And we are also thinking about how to institutionalize peace on the Korean Peninsula. So that was the main topic of this session. I hope that today's discussions can contribute to institutionalizing a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. And once that is done, I think that the peace is not far away. Thank you very much.